and welcome to the Psych and Business Podcast, where we highlight the integration of psychology and psychological principles into the world of business and organizations. I'm your host, Dr. Ernest Wayde. So, last week I introduced the concept of continuous personal development and talked about why it was important to understand some of the major leadership theories. And I kicked it off by talking about situational leadership. And if you haven't heard that episode, I suggest you go back and listen to it. It's actually a pretty good one. I also mentioned that it would be important for us to talk about some of the major skills and behaviors that are necessary for a leader, regardless of what leadership development theory that you ascribe to. And so this week, we're going to dive into one of those, and we're going to talk about one that I think really is important. So I'm going to say we're going to start with communication, but we're not going to start with verbal communication. We're going to start with listening, specifically active listening. Now, we usually roll listening into communication, which it is, but we think about communication, you are really thinking usually about how do you speak or how do you write. And so we really minimize the skill or the ability to listen and to listen well to what someone is saying and what someone is trying to communicate to us. And so active listening really doesn't get the respect or the attention that it really deserves. But if you think about it, the ability to actually listen, to understand, to appreciate what someone is saying, to really hear them, to understand and to kind of put yourself in their perspective, to appreciate their perspective, and to really understand what is being conveyed to you instead of just listening to react, listening to argue, listening to debate. It is really something that we don't do very often, and most people don't even understand that there's a difference. They don't understand that there's a difference between listening so that you can understand somebody's perspective, so that you can fully understand what they're communicating to you, rather than listening to just be able to argue, to challenge, to debate. And those there are different things there. And really, what I want to focus on is active listening to understand, to appreciate, to be able to respect other people's perspective. Um, so a lot of people are not even aware of what active listening is. So let's talk a little bit about what that is. So the concept of active listening, as I was introduced to it, is a psychotherapeutic technique, which basically means it's something that therapists do, and it helps us. It helps therapists to fully understand what a client is saying. It helps us to try to understand what the client is saying to us with their words, but also what they're trying to say, even if they're not able to communicate it verbally. And it helps us to try to understand the emotion behind what's being communicated. So a lot of times, people when people are speaking, they will use words, but they also use facial expressions. They also use body language. And so active listening is really paying attention to all of those things and giving the person the space and the opportunity to try and get across the message that they're communicating. It also requires you to engage in things like um, eye contact, looking at the person in the eye, making sure that they are able to communicate in a comfortable setting to you. And I think one of the things that I really wanted to focus on when we talk about active listening is you also have to listen for what is not being said. Because I think a lot of times when people are communicating, it's not just what they're saying, it's what they're not saying. And I have a great personal example about this. So I'm gonna share the story with my wife at my own risk here. Um, and so I hope this goes well. So one of the things that frustrates me about communicating with my wife is sometimes she'll just not respond when I'm talking, when we're in the middle of a conversation. At least I feel like we're in the middle of a conversation. And it very often happens when I make a suggestion that she doesn't like and isn't going to implement or isn't going to try or doesn't agree with, essentially. But instead of engaging me in the discussion and we going back and forth and having a discussion about it, she just will ignore me. She'll just ghost me. And I used to get very frustrated with it because I would assume that if I said something and she didn't respond, that she agreed, and so we were good to go. And very often that was not the case. In fact, this really used to frustrate me, and I had to spend some time analyzing the situation, really listening to what she said, but also listening for what wasn't being said, until I recognized that I was missing something. There was definitely no consent or agreement, but my mind just kind of put that in there. But when I started really engaging in active listening, I started to pay attention to what wasn't being said. So it actually happened this morning, where my wife will often complain that she's late in the morning, and so I will make a suggestion. Hey honey, you should really do this and do that, and try this, so that you won't be late in the morning. And she did not respond. And it used to be where that when that happened, I would assume, okay, she's going to take my suggestion, and then the next day the same thing would happen. She would be complaining that she's late, and I'd be thinking to myself, didn't I make this suggestion yesterday, and didn't you agree to it? And when I started paying attention, I recognized she didn't actually agree to it. When she doesn't want to agree to what I'm saying, or disagrees with what I'm saying or my approach or my suggestion, she'll just ghost me. And through active listening, I began to notice that the lack of consent, the lack of agreement, is actually a profound thing. And this happens a lot even in the workplace. You're as a manager, as a leader, will make a statement, will make an edict, will say, hey, here's what we're going to do, here's how we're going to do it. And very often you'll get back crickets. You'll get no response. And because you've got no response, you think, well, I guess everyone agrees we're good to go. And then come time to implement the change, or to do whatever it is that you've asked the team to do, your group to do, it's not being done. It's being done half-heartedly. People are complaining. People are negative. People are very clearly opposed to what it is that they're supposed to be doing. And your question is usually, when I made the statement, when I told everybody we were going to do this, nobody disagreed. But through active listening, that's something to notice, that nobody agreed either, right? And so that's something to pay attention to. And the act of really actively listening, not just to what people are saying, their body language, but what they're not saying, is really important. So if you're not paying attention to what people say and what people aren't saying, you're likely to miss that. And we have a lot of examples of things like that. But in the interest of remaining married, I'm not going to share any more of those personal stories about my wife. I will tell you that I had this experience with my kids as well. So, for example, my son it's just a great example of what we're talking about when we talk about active listening, because he listens, but he listens to be able to dispute, to be able to argue, to be able to win whatever discussion that we're having. And so he'll listen, but only so that he can really respond and actually really react. So he can react to what I'm saying. And he also is a great describer of the loudest person is the winner approach. So when we're talking, he will just get louder and louder and louder, because he feels like the louder he gets, the more right he is. And it's very hard to debate and discuss. We actually don't get very far, because it turns out that he's not listening, and then I stop listening, and it just becomes an exercise in futility. But I've seen this at work as well. So in the business setting, especially when I am asked to come in as a consultant to help an organization, the thing that I hear the most, probably in all the things that when I'm working directly with employees, is communication. And the challenge that comes up a lot is, our leaders are not listening to us. And when I take this back to the leaders, they say, what are they talking about? We do employee surveys, we have town halls, we have open door policies. And yet the employees still feel like, no, our leaders are not actually listening to what we're saying. And I think this highlights the discrepancy between listening and really active listening, right? I think when you're doing active listening, you really need to uh, try to work to understand the message that is being communicated to you, and the message that the employees are trying to communicate to you. Sometimes they don't use the right words, but if you pay attention to their facial expressions, to their body language, these are all things that help us engage in active listening. And there's actually research out there that shows that managers who engage in active listening are actually have more satisfied employees. The research also shows that a lot of managers don't even understand what active listening is and don't even understand the importance of listening, the skill of listening. And I think as leaders, as managers, we really need to do a better job of educating ourselves around what active listening really is, why it's important, why it helps us to better understand and appreciate our employees' perspectives, and how that helps the employee. If you don't understand what the employee is communicating to you, if you don't understand what your staff is communicating to you, if you don't understand what your clients, what your colleagues are trying to communicate to you, if you're not appreciating their perspective, if you don't fully understand where they're coming for and appreciate that, all you'll always be doing is trying to push your perspective, trying to put your ideas on them, and not really appreciating how their information and what they're communicating can really improve the value of whatever it is that you're trying to create, or increase efficiency in the organization. So active listening is really one of those important things that I think is a skill and behavior that all leaders, really everybody, should try to increase, but especially leaders and managers. So how do you do this? How do you engage in active listening? There's a lot out there about how to do it, but I think some of the key things to really do is to pay attention to when someone is communicating to you. And this might seem like an obvious one, but I can't tell you how many times even I have done this, is when I'm communicating with employees, I am multitasking. I'm only listening with half an ear because I'm responding to an email, or I'm thinking about something else, and I'm very often don't even look the person in the eye. And I think that is a clear indication that you're not active listening to yourself and to the person that you're talking to. So the first thing is to pay attention, look the person that you are speaking to, if at all possible, in the eye. Give them your full attention. Do not be responding to emails. Do not be looking at your computer. Look that person in the eye, and then don't interrupt. Now, this is really hard to do, especially when you feel like you're arguing or you're debating and you want to jump in. But I really encourage you to not interrupt the person that is speaking. Allow them the time, allow them the space and the energy to get through saying what it is that they're trying to communicate to you, right? And when you've done that, when they've actually communicated, when they've got to a point where you feel like, okay, they've expressed this, you need to clarify. You basically reflect what they've said to you, and clarify to make sure that you're understanding. So an example of that would be something like, thanks for telling me that. So what I'm hearing you say is, and then you basically tell them how you have understood the message that they're trying to communicate. You reflect it back to them, and this allows them the opportunity to make sure that you are A, understanding it as they have understood it, as they have tried to communicate it, or B, something got lost in translation, and so they need to take another attempt at trying to make sure that they're conveying the message that they want you to hear. And then also summarizing, summarize the message as you've understood it in your mind, so that you and the person that you're speaking to can all make sure that you're on the same page. I think the other thing that's important here is try to take the attitude of, I want to understand what this person is saying. I want to appreciate their perspective, rather than I'm going to defend my point of view. I want to make sure that they understand that I'm right. I want to pick apart their argument or pick apart their statement. That approach is really not helpful, and that's not active listening, right? Active listening really requires you to set aside your biases, set aside your position, and try not to be judgmental about what is being said. So I think those are a few things that you can start with. Again, there's a lot of things that you can do in active listening, but if you start with those basic things, paying attention, don't interrupt, reflect, clarify, summarize what that person is saying, so that you can make sure that you have understood it as they intend for you to do. So I think this is a good place to leave it for today. I hope you found this helpful, and I hope you will join us next time.